Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have another 16-game slate for the first round NCAA tournament. This is day 2. We have a massive slate here. I will get into a team breakdown after I do the guards and the forwards of my top picks. The way the slate looks, it doesn't look quite as good as yesterday, or I guess today's slate, rather. The slate is pretty tough, though there are some good priced guys across the slate when it comes to the value, but it is still kind of difficult from the expensive plays, and then also even the forwards. There's just not a whole lot there to like. So with that said, though, let's get into it here. We're going to start with our guards, and we're going to start with a guy that's actually can play both guard or forward, and that's definitely good today. That is Tucker DeVries for Drake. He has done pretty well this season. He's got an interesting matchup against Miami here. He's averaging 1 fantasy point per minute. He also plays over 30 minutes a game. He's also one of the highest usage players on the slate. And I expect him to have a really solid game here and a pretty tight matchup. He also rebounds the ball reasonably well, so that definitely gives him an advantage as well. Then we're going to look at Walter Clayton for Iona. Now, I do think this is a tough game for Iona against UConn, but I do think he has the most upside on the team. He also plays 30 or so minutes a game. He's got a ridiculous 1.13 fantasy point per minute, which is really good for a guard. We also have some nice upside there on the usage as well. So I really like him in that perspective, and he definitely just has good all-around stats that make me like him quite a bit on a slate like this, especially when it's hard to find good priced players. Then we're going to look at Ryan Nimhard for Creighton, and at $7,100, he's a really good value here. He's obviously not the high-scoring guy on his team, but he does average 0.76 fantasy points per minute, and he plays nearly 40 minutes a game, and he's got pretty good usage. He also tends to get assists and rebounds pretty decently, and so he has some nice upside here because he should be in the game, and I do have Creighton being one of the better scoring teams on the slate. Then we're going to look at Trey Alexander, his teammate, for Creighton as well. This is going to be a pretty good game, and he's priced pretty fairly, just under what Nimhard is, and he's got just as much upside just about here. He plays just about as many minutes, and he has a good fantasy points per minute. He also gets a pretty good usage as well when he plays, so I like him a lot in this. He doesn't quite get the assists that Nimhard does, but he does get the rebounds, and so I do think he's a viable option on this slate. Then we're going to look at Keontae George here for Baylor. Let's find him here for Baylor against UCSB. Now, this is an interesting game because they are projected to win by a pretty good amount. But I expect him to play well in this one, and he's a pretty good value play based on his price. He's not too expensive here. He doesn't get the minutes that some of the other guys get, but he has a good enough fantasy points per minute that at this price range, he should be good as a quality option on your lineup. Then we're going to look at Roman Penn for Drake against Miami. Now, Drake actually has a very tight game here against Miami, and it does seem like that their team is underpriced here. So he has a pretty ridiculous 1.01 fantasy point per minute, and he plays a pretty good chunk of minutes at around 34. His usage is also very high for this team, and he does rebound and get assists as well, which definitely gives us some advantage on a matchup like this. So I really do like him here. He's got nice upside and looks like a great potential value play. A low-end, a high value play when it comes to his price. And then Burden for Kennesaw State. Now this is a risky play, but he's a $6,500, which gives him some viability here. He's played pretty solid all season long. I looked at his stats, even against decent teams, he has done pretty well. And while Xavier is probably the best team he's played all season long, he doesn't really have a huge drop-off in risk here. He's been in double figures in almost every game in 2023, with the exception of one against Jackson State in the middle of the year, where he got into some foul issues. So I really expect him to have a really 30-plus minute game here and be able to score points. He shoots a lot of balls, and he has some good usage for this matchup. Then we're going to look at Mr. Battle for Montana State. Now, this is a very interesting matchup against Kansas State, though it is a low-scoring game. He is one of the best usages on his team, and he also, he is very scoring dependent, but he's priced low enough that he's definitely got some viability on the slate. I really think he's a good option, and he looks just like a great play in general here. Then we're going to look at Robin Duncan for Vermont. Now, this is an interesting matchup against Marquette, and he just seems criminally underpriced. He averages 0.92 fantasy points per game, and he's been over 30 fantasy points a lot as of recently, and I just expect him to have a good game here. He's the best player on their team, and so I think he's very viable on the slate. Then we'll look at Devin Cambridge for ASU. Now, he is the cheaper Cambridge on this team, but he has more upside in this matchup based on his price, and he's a pretty good value play here, especially considering the fact that he does get a decent fantasy points per minute, and he should be able to get some rebounds and stuff in this game as well, and it should be a pretty tight game in general. And then we're going to look at Aaron Delaney for Vermont. Now, he looks like an interesting value play here. He's got some nice upside. He's had some pretty big games lately, and so he has a good skill set in order to play well here, though he is somewhat scoring dependent, so you do have to be aware of that, but he does have some utility on the slate. And then finally for the guards, Trey Galloway for Indiana. Now, he looks like a pretty risky play, but he does play a decent 25 or so minutes a game, and he does have a decent usage when he does play. It's just and because he does start, but he doesn't typically do a ton. But if he can score 5 or 10 points, he'll pay off here from a fantasy perspective because he'll get some rebounds and assists that will help push him over the top. He really doesn't have too many bad games. He just hasn't. He's not somebody that's gonna 5 or like 7x or 8x on you. But he doesn't. He's somebody you can definitely utilize that won't hurt you too much if you need a value play. So as for the forwards, we're going to start with Zach Edey. Edey has some big time upside here. He's got a good matchup against FDU, but the risk here is a blowout where he doesn't play as many minutes. That is a concern here, but he's been playing extremely well. He's had 4 double-doubles in the last 5 games. I expect those to continue here, but he's a little bit risky based on the matchup, but he's a good alternative to Trace Jackson Davis, who I'm going to talk about here now. He, for Indiana, is the one of the highest expensive players on the slate. He's had 4 straight games over 50 fantasy points. This game should be tighter than Purdue's game, which makes him a little bit safer. He's also a stat stuffer. He gets points, rebounds, and assists, and even steals and blocks. So I really think he's probably a better play than Edey, but you couldn't go wrong with either one, really, assuming that you think Edey will stick around in the game long enough. And then a third option at this price range, an Oscar Tshiebwe for Kentucky, who's just a double-double machine, leads the country in rebounds just about, and will have all the work that he can handle in this game. He's a pretty dominant player especially when he's rebounding well, and Providence really does rebound pretty good, but they don't have like a bigger guy who can push Oscar around, so I expect him to have a big game in this one, especially against a former teammate, and so I look for him to have a great game. Then we're going to look at some value plays at this position, one being Great Ozabar from Montana State. Now, he's been pretty consistent lately. In fact, most of the season he's been pretty good. He's only had a few games early in the year where he wasn't good, but he plays a pretty limited set of minutes, and so that is a concern here. But he does have some utility on the slate, but he is risky because of the minutes. But regardless if that game gets out of hand or not, he will be somebody to consider. Then we'll look at Matty Sissoko for Michigan State. He has some utility here as he's been starting, and while he's not somebody that's going to get 30 fantasy points, he shouldn't hurt you too much. He pretty much has been over 9 fantasy points in every game this season, and we really only need him to get around 12 or 14, so he's definitely able to do that here. He's a little bit risky, but he's a decent value play at forward where there's just really not a whole lot. And then I've got a couple guys that are pending injury. Diaz Graham, he would start if Beatty Federico is out for Pittsburgh, and if that is the case, then he becomes a great play here. But we'll have to wait and see close to the matchup. And then another one is Dewana for NC State, who's in who would get the start if um, uh, sorry, for North Carolina State if Gant is out, and so do keep that in mind. Make sure to check in on those guys. Luckily, those guys a little bit earlier in the slate, so hopefully we'll get the news on them. I believe the Pittsburgh game is at 2:55, and the NC State game is at 3:45. So hopefully we can get that news in a point where it would make it useful to utilize here on the slate. So with that said, guys, let me go into my breakdown of each individual game. We have a lot of games here to consider. Obviously, with the big slate, we have a couple teams that are high scoring: Xavier, Purdue, and Gonzaga. We have several games that are pretty high scoring: the Xavier game, the Creighton game, and the Gonzaga game, and the Memphis game. And then we have a few teams that are pretty low scoring: VCU, Pittsburgh, Fairdale, Dickinson. And then we have a couple blowout games. Xavier is a 13-point favorite. Marquette's a 10-point favorite. Purdue's a 23-point favorite. Gonzaga's a 15-point favorite. Most of all the other games are pretty close, and so I do think it's a really good slate from that perspective. But it does seem like most of the players are overpriced today. But with that said, let's get into the teams themselves. We'll start with Michigan State here. Now, Michigan State is a 2-point favorite against USC. It is a risky team because it's a lower scoring team on the slate. Hauser is a good secondary play, and Cisco is a value play. They do play 3 guys over 30 minutes a game, and as far as defense goes, both these teams are mid-road offense and defensive team for the tournament. Either team could win this game, but I expect it to be a pretty slow down game. As for USC, I'm looking at that team being a slow down, tough game team. They play more guys than Michigan State does game to game, though they do have some good rebounders. And Peterson, White, and Morgan, I really just don't see much to like here on this team, especially in a tight matchup like this. And so I'm mostly just suggesting to avoid them. As for Xavier and Kennesaw State, this game has a 13-point spread in Xavier's favor. Xavier's got a really good offense, not a great defense, and then Kennesaw State has a really bad offense and defense. Everybody though for Xavier is overpriced, but if you do think it's going to get out of hand early, Quad wouldn't be a bad secondary value play. The starters are also secondary plays here, and they do have some upside, but they are a little bit risky. As for Kennesaw State, if you want to use somebody here, Burden would be the guy, but he is risky here because this game could get out of hand early. But he has as good chance of anybody as being the top scorer for his team, and so I do think he's worth taking a look at, but he's still pretty risky. There's not anybody on this team that just jumps out and makes me super excited. As for Baylor and UCSB here, now this game is somewhat lopsided with Baylor being a 10-point favorite. Baylor is also one of the best offenses on the slate, and neither team is very good defensively. But for Baylor, Keontae George is the best player on the team. He is priced pretty fairly here. Though there's a couple secondary plays as well, but there's a risk of blowout, and so that is a little bit of a concern. As for UCSB, Mitchell is really the only decent play here, though he is a secondary play. But I avoid this team for the most part in this matchup against, it's not going to be the highest scoring game, and they also play a pretty deep bench as well. So then we're going to look at VCU and St. Mary. Now this game is one of the slowest games on the slate, and for St. Mary, this team is just way overpriced here. Despite the fact that they play a tight lineup, they are unplayable in the slowest game of the slate. I don't see any reason to utilize these guys, and so I would avoid them like the plague here. There's just nothing to like in general. Then we're going to look at the worst scoring team on the slate in VCU. Both these teams also tend to be pretty good defensively, but neither one of them are great offensively. VCU this has a terrible offense, and they're going against a better defense than they are. I could see either one of these teams winning because it's a four what do you call it? A 4 point match, but I just don't like either team, and either game in that game. It's just a really ugly matchup. Also, VCU plays more guys uh, as well, so they play a pretty deep bench. As for Marquette and Vermont, here we're gonna start looking at Marquette. They are a 10-point favorite here. They are also pretty overpriced. Kolick could be a stat stuffer here, and be used for as an alternative to some of the others, but I'd avoid them for the most part, though they don't play too deep of a bench. As for Vermont, they do play a deeper bench, but Duncan and Delaney have good upside. There are a few secondary plays here too, but I tread lightly on the expensive guys on this team. I'd stick with the cheaper dudes, as both these teams are decent offensively, but not that great defensively. I think it could be a tighter game than what it looks like. Then we're going to go ahead and get into the Iowa State and Pittsburgh game here. Now, Iowa State is favored to win this game by 4. This is the other game that's super low scoring, and it's just really terrible. ISU is not a good offense. They do play good defense, though, but they're not a good offense, and so I would avoid them. As for Pittsburgh, if Federico doesn't play, Guerrero, Diaz, Graham would be a good value play. Otherwise, I'm mostly going to avoid this team because ISU is a pretty decent defensive team, and while Pittsburgh's a decent offensive team, I don't think that they're going to fare too well in this one. So, but overall, they do have some utility from value perspective if there's injuries that play out. As for Creighton and North Carolina State, now this game has some interest here. This is a high-scoring game. Creighton is also favored to win by 5, and they have four starters who play 30 minutes. And while they have a bit of inconsistency, they look good in this one. Kalbrenner and Sherman are the secondary plays from the 4. The other 2 are the top-tier options in Alexander and Nembhard. I definitely recommend taking a look at that team and utilizing some upside there. As for NC State, they're a little bit harder to roster. They are a little bit overpriced here, and if Gant is out, that would give Dewanda a start. He would be a good cheap value play, but outside of that, it's going to be hard to utilize too much here on their team. As for Iona and UConn, now this game has got a 9-point spread, but I do expect it to be closer. I think both these teams are pretty decent offensively and defensively, and so I expect it to be a pretty tough game for both teams. But I do think that there's a lot of secondary plays on UConn. Not a whole lot of top-tier plays, but, Sagano and Jackson and Kilgan, look okay. And so does Hawkins, but I definitely kind of feel like they're a little bit overpriced, but not a lot. As for Iona, Clayton Jr. has big upside here. He has a few other secondary plays on this team, but UConn plays a good defense, so it's a tough game for them, but I do think Clayton can do whatever he wants in this one. So I do think Iona is kind of a team that has a potential for an upset. They also have a pretty starting lineup, like they don't play too deep, and so I do think that they have some utility here. As for Purdue against Ferdale Dickinson, this game is the biggest spread on the slate at 23 points, and so I expect Purdue to do well here. Edey, he's a great alternative to Oscar or Jackson Davis of Indiana, but I like those two a little bit better since he's a little bit riskier due to the blowout potential of this game. Also, Fairleigh Dickinson has absolutely no defense whatsoever, and so you could even suggest that some of the other players are secondary plays, but they are overpriced, so do keep that in mind. As for Fairleigh Dickinson, everyone here is way overpriced. They're going to get destroyed in this game. I really don't see any reason to like anybody here. They do play a pretty deep bench as well. If you had to use somebody, Roberts would be the guy, but my goodness, they don't really play anything good. So I don't really see any risk to Purdue at all. Then we're going to look at Providence and Kentucky. Now this is an interesting game here. This should be a 4-point spread right now. And this game is actually a pretty even matchup. They're both pretty good offensive teams, and both of them have some defensive struggles. Who knows for Kentucky who's going to start, because most of the guys are back from injury. But whoever starts here will definitely be somebody to consider. But Oscar Tshiebwe is obviously the top dog, and he will be a great option on the slate. I do think he's got a good opportunity in this one as a good alternative to some of the other big expensive players. As for Providence, they have a good offense and a bad defense. Unfortunately, everyone is overpriced, but they do carry some secondary plays, especially guys that get in pick and roll situations like Hopkins and Croswell. So I do think that they have some upside here, but they're still a little bit risky. As for Miami and Drake, I do think this is a tight game, and it has a 2-point spread in Vegas. It's pretty. Drake is a better defensive team than Miami, but Miami has a better offense. As for Miami, Miller is slightly overpriced. Everyone else is way overpriced, and the injury of Omir is also concerning. This could be a game that they end up losing, so do keep that in mind. But it is an interesting game nonetheless. As for Drake, Miami isn't a great defense, and Penn has a decent upside here. DeVries also has some upside, so I do like Drake as a kind of a good team to pull some value from. Then we're going to look at the next couple games here, Gonzaga and Grand Canyon. Now, everybody on Gonzaga is overpriced. Despite being a decent matchup for them, I'd avoid this game for the most part simply because it's likely going to be a blowout. Grand Canyon is not a very good team. They don't really play good defense, so they do have a good offense. I expect it to be a high-scoring game, but it's really going to be hard to roster anybody on Gonzaga. As for Grand Canyon, if you wanted to utilize Harrison or McLaughlin, they do have some upside here due to their price being okay, but they're both secondary plays. And Darago also has some upside with his rebounding potential. All are secondary plays due to the risk of getting blown out. As for Memphis and FAU, this is a 2-point game and a high-scoring game on the slate. For Memphis, Williams and Davis have upside, but they're not ideal matchups because the prices are a little bit high. But they do have some utility here, and they do rebound the ball well. As for Florida State, I'd avoid this team like this plague. They play no one over 30 minutes per game, and they are overpriced for a tough matchup. It seems like a tight matchup, but it's both teams play good defense and good offense, and so I think it's actually going to be a little lower scoring than what we think. And it's hard to use anybody on that team when you consider the fact that everybody plays a lot, about the same amount of minutes for their starters. Excuse me. For Kansas State and Montana State, this game does have some interest here. Kansas State is favored to win by 8 points, and Johnson and Noel have some secondary upside. Not sure you want to pull much else from this game, though, but they do have a pretty good offense, but they are tough defensively. Montana State's also a pretty good defense, but they're not good offensively. They do have some cheap options, though, as Ozabar looks like an interesting value play, as does Battle, but they are a little bit risky as a lower scoring game on the slate. As for Indiana and Kent State, Indiana is favored to win this game by 4 points, which honestly is surprising it'd be that low. But honestly, Indiana's had a lot of bad losses. Trace Jackson Davis is the best stat stuffer on the slate. Galloway is a good cheap option. They really don't have much else that jump off the page at you as a good play, and so they are risky, especially considering Kent State does actually have a decent defensive team considering their seed. This should be a lower scoring game as a result, and because of the tougher defense that both teams play, I would probably stay away from Kent State, plus they go pretty deep on the bench. As for the final game, TCU and ASU, this could be a very interesting matchup here. It's hard to love TCU being a 6-point favorite here because both teams are pretty good defensively, and neither team is that great offensively. But Bo is a decent secondary option for their team. Everybody else is a little bit overpriced. As for Arizona State, Dev Campbell is the best play here. Though they do have a couple of secondary plays, but I don't think it's wise to pull too much from this lower scoring team and lower scoring game. But with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. I hope you're enjoying the college basketball content. The NCAA tournament has started off really good. It's been fun, so hopefully it continues to be good. Again, thanks for liking, commenting, subscribing, and have a nice day, guys.